Elias Carter hadn't spoken to another soul in nearly 2 decades. The last time someone had knocked on his cabin door, the world was different. The war had just ended, the scars on his body were fresh, and the ones in his heart were deeper than any surgeon's blade could reach. After he left the army, he drifted west with nothing but a rusted rifle, a pack mule, and a mind full of noise he couldn't turn off. The towns felt too crowded. The people talked too much. So, he disappeared into the trees of the Bitterroot Wilderness and never came back. His cabin stood alone, miles from the nearest road, nestled between tall pine ridges and a quiet bend in the river. It was made of hand-hewn logs, a stone chimney, and a porch that faced the sunrise. There were no fences, no livestock beyond a few hens and an old mule named Jasper, and no visitors. Locals called him the ghost of Dry Hollow, but most weren't even sure he was real. Kids told stories about him. Some said he was a deserter, others a killer. But Elias didn't care. Let the world say what it wanted. It had done enough. Talking already. The days passed in routine. He rose with delight, boiled coffee over the fire, chopped wood, fished the stream, and spoke only to Jasper or himself. Nights were long and cold in the winter, and silent in the summer. Sometimes, when the wind howled just right, it carried voices, ghosts of battlefields, men shouting orders, screams buried beneath gunfire. He'd sit by the fire, gripping a mug, jaw tight, and wait for the voices to fade. They always did. Eventually, Elias had aged, but he'd done so without mirrors or witnesses. His beard had grown long and streaked with silver. His hands were calloused, and his shoulders still strong from work. But his eyes, those tired blue eyes, were the same ones that had looked back at him from the trenches. From hospital beds, from graves dug too shallow and too fast. He lived deliberately, if not peacefully, and he believed he'd die that way, unseen, unmourned, and untouched. Then came the sound. It was faint at first. Elias had been chopping wood behind the cabin, his axe biting rhythmically into the log. But he paused, sweat rolling down his temple, and cocked his head. A sound, thin, human, hoarse, not an animal, not the wind. He set the axe aside slowly, hand drifting toward the old rifle resting against the chopping stump. He waited. There it was again. A cry, not loud, but desperate. Elias hadn't seen another person in years, but he hadn't forgotten how to track sound. He moved silently, years of soldier's instinct rising from somewhere deep, through brush and pine, stepping carefully over roots, pausing with each snap of a branch. The cry came again, weaker now. He followed it past the river bend and through a narrow thicket of cedar trees. The trail narrowed, then widened into a shaded hollow, and there he saw her. At first, he thought it was a scarecrow or a hallucination, a figure tied to an old cedar tree, arms raised, wrists bound with rawhide strips, ankles scratched and bleeding. She wore a faded dress, torn and dirt-streaked. Her hair clung to her face in wet strands. Her body sagged from exhaustion. She was young, maybe late 20s, but broken by more than just fatigue. Bruises lined her cheek, blood-stained, the edge of her neckline. Her eyes met his. They didn't plead. They didn't cry. They just stared, half-lidded, hollow, full of a quiet that reminded him of something buried far back in his soul. Without a word, Elias lowered his rifle. He reached into his coat for a knife and moved forward slowly, as if approaching a wounded animal. She flinched when he raised the blade, but he only sliced the ropes. They fell away, and her body collapsed forward. He caught her, shocked by how light she was, skin over bone, all breath and no strength. She didn't thank him. He didn't ask for answers. He simply picked her up, turned toward the cabin, and began the long walk back. For 20 years, Elias Carter had chosen silence. But this day, that silence had been broken, and nothing, not even the deep wilderness, would be the same again. The forest was still as Elias carried her back to his cabin. Not even the birds sang. The weight of her in his arms was strange, not heavy, exactly, but unfamiliar. It had been 20 years since he had touched another human being, and now here he was, cradling a half-conscious woman through the underbrush, her head against his chest, her breathing shallow and ragged. Her skin was cold to the touch, clammy with sweat and grime. Bits of leaves and pine needles clung to her tangled hair. Her lips were cracked, dry. She looked like someone who'd been through hell and left behind. Elias didn't ask who she was or where she'd come from. He didn't need to. The rope burns on her wrists, the bruises on her arms, the blood at her temple told him enough. Someone had tied her to that tree. Someone had left her there to die, and someone might still be looking for her. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was low on the horizon, casting long golden slashes through the trees. Elias shouldered open the door, walked inside, and gently lowered her onto his bed, only bed in the cabin. It was a simple thing, a wooden frame, old wool blankets, and a mattress stuffed with straw. She didn't even stir when her body met the fabric. She had slipped into something deeper than sleep. He worked quickly but carefully. Years alone had made him precise. He stoked the fire, warmed water in a tin kettle, and dug out a small tin of salve he hadn't used in years back when he still got blisters from working too hard. Before his calluses thickened like bark, He washed her wounds with warm cloths, mindful of her battered skin, and used the salve sparingly on the raw patches. He wrapped her wrists with torn cotton strips and covered her with 2 blankets. Then he sat down at the edge of the bed and watched her breathe. For hours, she didn't move. Her chest rose and fell, shallow and uneven. Elias kept checking her temperature, placing the back of his hand against her forehead, then her neck. She was burning up. He soaked a rag in cold water and pressed it gently against her skin. Once her body flinched. Once, she murmured something he couldn't understand. But she didn't wake. The night deepened outside. Coyotes howled in the distance. Elias didn't sleep. He made a weak broth from dried vegetables and a scrap of jerky, though he doubted she'd be able to swallow it yet. He set it near the fire to keep warm. Then he sat back down and stared at her. Every now and then, his eyes drifted to her face-off. Despite the bruises, mouth slightly open, lashes long against her pale cheeks. There was something haunting about her presence. Not just her silence, but the feeling that she had been meant to die. And somehow, he didn't ask himself why he'd saved her, he already knew. Somewhere in his past, so far back he rarely let himself remember, he'd watched someone suffer, someone close, and he'd done nothing. He'd been younger then, scared. But that face, the way it faded into death, had never left him. So when he'd heard the cry among the cedars, he hadn't hesitated. Maybe it had nothing to do with her. Maybe it was about redemption. Or maybe it was just about being human. Again, only for a day, around midnight. She stirred. Her eyes blinked open, unfocused at first, then clearer. She looked around, saw the fire, the rough-hewn cabin walls, the table, in the corner. Then she saw him sitting in the old rocking chair by the hearth, rifle leaning beside him, a cup of black coffee in his hand. "You're safe," Elias said, his voice like gravel. She blinked, lips barely parting. "Where?" she croaked, her voice a dry whisper. "You're in my home," he said. "I found you, in the trees." She tried to sit up, but winced and fell back. "Don't move," he said, more gently this time. "You're hurt bad, but you'll live." She stared at him for a moment. Her eyes flicked to the door, the window, then back to him. Distrust, fear, but also something else. A faint flicker of recognition, perhaps, or disbelief that a stranger had done something kind. She swallowed hard, her voice barely a breath. They'll come for me." Elias didn't flinch. He nodded once and leaned forward, placing the rifle across his lap. "Let them try." The night settled thick around the cabin like a second skin. Wind whispered against the logs. The fire cracked low in the hearth, casting flickering shadows that danced across the walls. The woman lay still beneath the wool blankets, her breath, shallow but steadier now. Elias hadn't moved from his chair. He sat with the rifle balanced across his lap, eyes fixed on the door, as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. Outside, the forest waited in hush-watchful cold. Alive. She stirred again sometime near dawn. Her eyes opened wider this time, taking in the room with less panic and more focus. Her throat was raw, but she managed to croak. "What's your name?" Elias didn't answer at first. Names were things of the old world. Things you said when you were part of something town's families, units. He hadn't spoken his own name out loud in nearly a decade. But something about her voice, thin as it was, reached into that closed-off part of him where the last of his humanity still flickered. "Elias," he said quietly. "Elias Carter." She blinked, trying to sit up again. This time he helped her, sliding behind her back and bracing her gently. She winced, breath catching as the pain woke with her. Still, she managed to nod. "I'm Anna." It came out soft, unsure, as if she had to test it before trusting herself to speak it fully. He repeated it in his head. Anna, a name that sounded like spring, like something delicate. Out of place in this savage stretch of country. He offered her the mug of warm broth, lifting it to her lips. She drank greedily at first, then slower. Her body remembering how to want things again: warmth, food, life. When she finished, she leaned back against the pillow, eyes fluttering shut for a moment. "You were tied to that tree for how long?" Elias asked. Not because he wanted answers he didn't believe in forcing someone to dig up wounds too soon, but because he needed to understand what kind of danger might be coming. 2 days, she murmured. "Maybe more. I don't know." He nodded, gaze lowering. That explained the fever, the trembling, the way her body sagged like it had forgotten how to hold itself together. "Who did it?" She hesitated, her hands, still raw and bandaged, clenched beneath the blankets. Her voice dropped lower, almost too soft to hear. "Men, with no uniforms, traitors or bandits. Maybe both. They said I talked too much. They said I saw something I shouldn't." Elias's jaw tightened. He didn't press her. He didn't need the whole story to recognize the pattern. He'd seen it before: women silenced, punished, left behind like broken things. Sometimes the frontier didn't bother hiding its cruelty. "They think you're dead," Elias said. She nodded faintly. "Good," he said. He stood slowly and walked to the window, pushing the curtain aside with 2 fingers. The woods stretched on, quiet and deep. He knew the signs of tracking parties: broken branches, disturbed brush, Crows fleeing in low sweeps but saw nothing yet. That didn't mean they weren't coming. Just that they hadn't arrived. I won't be a burden, she said suddenly, voice stronger now. He turned to her, brow furrowed. I can go, once I can stand. I just needed a place too, she swallowed. To not die. Elias shook his head slowly. You're not leaving. Not until you can defend yourself. And even then, not if they're still out there. Anna stared at him, surprised. She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. Something about his tone steady, unshaken cut through her fear, like a blade. Why help me? She asked after a pause. Why risk it? Elias returned to the chair, his voice low. Because no one helped the last one. She watched him. For a moment, the firelight playing across the lines of his face. There were stories etched in his skin: battle, grief, solitude. He wasn't just a man. He was a ruin. But he was a ruin that had chosen to stand between her and whatever devil had left her tied to that tree. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees like some spirit shaken from slumber. Inside, two ghosts, one of war, one of quietly beneath a roof neither had expected to share. By the third day, Anna could walk a little, not far, and not without Elias's help. But she could put weight on her legs and lean against the walls of the cabin without collapsing. She wore one of his old shirts, far too big for her small frame, sleeves rolled up to her elbows, the hem brushing her knees. Her wrists were still wrapped in clean bandages, and the bruises across her neck and ribs were fading slowly to dull yellow. But the fire had returned to her eyes, a light that hadn't been there when she first woke. Elias didn't talk much. He never had, but he watched her, not out of suspicion but out of instinct. She moved like someone who had been hunted. Always listening, always flinching at sudden sounds, like a twig snapping or a bird taking flight. When the wind blew too hard through the cracks in the cabin, she'd go stiff. Elias understood. He had his own ghost noises that made his spine stiffen, shadows that made his hand drift to his rifle even when he knew better. Late that afternoon, while Anna rested by the fire, Elias went outside. The air had changed. There was something. In the wind and edge, he knelt near the tree line, brushing his fingers along the dirt. His eyes narrowed. Tracks. Fresh. Not from a deer, not from elk. These were boot prints, 3 sets, maybe 4, one heavier than the others. Deep heel grooves, like someone stomping with purpose. He scanned the underbrush. A twig had been snapped, deliberately bent in the wrong direction, marking a trail, and there, faintly, a curl of smoke far off through the trees, too faint for a fire made in comfort. It was the kind of smoke that came from damp wood and haste, from someone trying not to be seen. He stood slowly and looked back at the cabin. The walls, though thick, would not stop bullets. The windows had no shutters. The door was a simple pine slab with a rusty latch. If they came, it wouldn't hold. Then Baki returned inside, his face harder than before. Anna looked up. You saw something? Elias nodded, pulling his rifle from the wall. He checked the chamber, loaded it with slow, practiced hands, then slung his old pistol around his hip. They're tracking, he said. Her face paled. How many? 4? Maybe more. She swallowed hard, curling into herself. Elias knelt by the stove and pulled up a loose floorboard. Beneath it, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a second pistol and 2 boxes of ammunition. He handed the pistol to her, along with a few rounds. She stared at it for a long second before taking it. I haven't fired one in years. Then practice, he said simply. They spent the next hour in silence, Anna loading and reloading, her hands shaking at first, Elias checking the lines of sight from the windows, blocking one with a wood plank, leaving the others partially open for coverage. He built a second fire pit just outside the back wall, a decoy, just in case. Then he showed Anna where to hide, and how to shoot from cover without exposing too much of herself. You've done this before, she said quietly. Elias didn't answer right away. He looked at the darkening trees. Long time ago, different, enemy. She looked at him. Wah, he nodded. Wah, raiders, drifters, all the same now. The forest grew darker. Dusk came early under the trees. They ate in silence hardtack and beans and drank black coffee. Anna's hands were steadier now. She kept the pistol close, resting it in her lap like a sleeping animal. Will they kill us? She asked. Elias met her gaze. They'll try. She didn't flinch at that. Instead, she nodded and said, then let them come. He saw something in her, then something more than fear or pain. Resolve. And though he wouldn't say it out loud, it stirred something in him he hadn't felt in years. The kindling of a fight worth having. As the last light drained from the sky, they waited. 2 strangers bound by circumstance. 2 souls who had been discarded by the world. And now, together, they would make a stand. Because even here, at the edge of nowhere, justice still had a price. And Elias Carter was ready to collect. The air was heavy with tension as the moon lifted over the treetops. Its pale light filtered through the branches like cold silk, casting thin beams across the clearing. Inside the cabin, Elias stood by the front window, rifle in hand, eyes scanning the dark like a man waiting for ghosts. Anna sat at the edge of the bed, her fingers wrapped tight around the pistol. She hadn't spoken in over an hour. Neither had he. Words felt useless now. Then it came. A soft crunch of boot-on-leaf litter. Not close, maybe 50 yards out, but Elias heard it. He raised a hand to Anna, and she immediately dropped into a crouch behind the stove. They had practiced this. She was ready. Another step. Then two more. Slow, purposeful. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to rush them. Elias stepped onto the porch, silent as a shadow, rifle raised but not yet aimed. His cabin sat on a slight ridge, giving him the advantage. If they came from the pines, he'd see them first. His breath steamed in the cold moonlit air. He stood absolutely still. Then a voice called out low, gravelly, edged with a drawl that didn't belong to these parts. "Evenin', friend, ain't here for trouble." Elias said nothing. The voice was coming from the trees just to the east. "Name's Burke. We was passin' through. Saw your fire." Still Elias said nothing. Long pause. "You seen a girl? Brown hair, thin, might be confused. Might be dangerous." Elias's jaw clenched. Burke stepped forward. Into the moonlight. He was tall, broad, with a ragged brown duster and a shotgun slung over one shoulder. His face was leathery, calm, the kind of calm that comes from hurting people without losing sleep. Behind him, three more men fanned out quietly, but not quietly enough. Elias lowered the rifle a fraction, just enough to make it look like he wasn't going to fire, but his finger never left the trigger. "No girl here," he lied. Burke smiled. "That's so." Elias didn't blink. "This is my land. Move on." Burke raised his hands, all friendly-like. "No offense meant, mister. Just figured you might have seen her. Tiny thing, barefoot. Last we saw her. Got a bad habit of talkin' when she shouldn't. She run from you." Elias asked. Burke chuckled. "Something like that." Voice dropped to a knife's edge. "Then she ain't yours to chase." Silence. One of Burke's men shifted behind him. A glint of metal flashed in the moonlight rifle barrel. Elias lifted his own rifle just slightly, enough to remind them of the range. Burke raised a brow, still smiling. "Now that don't seem neighborly." "I'm not your neighbor." Burke's smile slipped. "If she's in there, we'll find her, one way or another." Elias didn't move. "Try it." That hung in the air like frost. Cold, solid. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Burke nodded. "All right then." He turned and disappeared back into the trees. The other men followed, reluctant, slow, watching Elias the whole way. Within moments, they melted back into the dark. Elias stayed on the porch long after the last boot step faded. Then he turned and went back inside. Anna looked up from behind the stove. "Was it them?" He nodded. "They'll be back." Her lips tightened. Elias walked to the fire, set his rifle against the wall, and stirred the embers. Sparks snapped into the chimney. He didn't look at her when he spoke again. "They're not used to being told no. Next time they won't." Knock. Anna stood, walked over, and placed the pistol gently on the table. Her voice was clear now. "Then we won't wait." He looked up at her and saw, not the broken woman tied to a tree, but someone forged, new in the flame of fear and defiance. They were no longer strangers sharing a roof. They were now two fighters bound by one truth. The world had already tried to break them both. It wouldn't get a second chance. They came just before dawn. No calls, no warning, no slow approach. Just the sharp crack of a rifle through the still morning around, the sound of glass shattering in the cabin's front window. Elias was already moving, grabbing his rifle from its place by the fire while Anna rolled from the cot to the floor with practiced speed. They'd spent the last 2 days preparing for this, checking angles, measuring distances, reinforcing the walls with stacked firewood and dirt-packed crates, but nothing ever prepares you for the first shot fired in anger. Elias dropped low and crept toward the window's edge. Smoke curled from the pine trees east of the clearing, the same direction Burke and his men had vanished days earlier. Another shot rang out, slamming into the outer wall. Then another. Wood splintered. 4 men, maybe 5, Elias whispered, peeking through a small slit between the boards. 2 rifles, 1 shotgun. Close enough to flank, if they're smart. Anna nodded, her breath steady, pistol clutched in both hands. She was kneeling behind the stacked crates, where Elias had shown her to shoot between gaps for cover. Her fear was still there, retched in the tightness of her jaw, the way her shoulders braced, but it didn't stop her. That was the thing Elias had come to respect most. She didn't let fear choose for her. Elias fired a warning shot, high and wide, enough to remind them he could see. Then a voice called out, rough and mocking, "You should have handed her over, old man." Anna flinched, but said nothing. Elias chambered another round, "And let you hang her like you did the last girl." Silence followed. For a moment, even the birds seemed to hold their breath. Then, a different voice, lower, closer. "He's seen too much, we kill him both." Anna's eyes flicked to Elias. "We hold," he said simply. "No matter what." They came in fast after that. One man charged from the left, shotgun raised. Elias caught him clean in the thigh, dropped him screaming behind a stump. Another tried the right flank, thinking the woodpile would shield him. Anna's shot was off center, but it grazed the man's shoulder, enough to knock him down and send him scrambling back into the trees. They paused again. Burke's voice returned. She's not worth dying for, rancher. Elias didn't answer with words. He fired again. More silence. Then a ragged scream rage, not pain, and two of them broke cover at once. One rushed the front, the other tried to sneak around the back. Elias dropped the first. Anna turned and fired at the second, her shot missing but close enough to make the man dive into a thorny bush with a curse. The moment gave Elias time to pivot, and his next shot sent the attacker howling back into the trees. Then the quiet returned. Smoke drifted across the clearing. A crow cried somewhere far off. Anna reloaded with trembling fingers. Her hands were slick with sweat, but she moved like someone who had chosen her side and would not be moved. Elias crouched beside her. You all right? She nodded, jaw clenched. Yo, he gave a grunt. Old bones, still working. Then, from behind the trees, came a single whistle. High, sharp, unmistakably planned. Another one answered from across the ridge. Elias stiffened. More coming. How many I don't know. But that whistle wasn't from Burke. Anna looked at him, eyes wide. You think he brought others? No, Elias said slowly. I think someone else is hunting him. They waited, listening, hearts hammering. In the silence, then footsteps, dozens, but not charging, marching, organized. A deep voice called out in Apache slow, commanding. Anna turned, startled. But Elias had already lowered his rifle. Out of the trees stepped 6 Apache warriors, dressed not in war paint but in hunting leathers, bows slung over their shoulders, rifles across their backs. Behind them, more followed, young men, elders, even to women with braided hair and eyes that had seen too much. At their center stood a tall man with gray streaks in his hair and a bone necklace over his chest. He raised one hand in peace. Anna's breath caught. Elias said only one word, friends, and the entire story changed. The Apache did not speak at first. They entered the clearing in quiet procession, eyes alert, hands near their weapons but not hostile. Elias stepped off the porch, lowering his rifle slowly, keeping his hands where they could be seen. He understood the code of men who had lost too much. Approach with caution, speak with respect. Behind him, Anna stood in the cabin's shadow, pistol still in her grip, watching the warriors with guarded awe. She had never seen so many Apache in one place and never under the banner of something other than fear. The tall man at the front told her, proud, carved from the same earth as the mountains behind them, nodded once. He stepped forward. Am Taza, he said in English, his voice low but full of weight. Son of a woman who was taken, brother of one who never returned. Elias inclined his head. Elias Cutter, I live here. We know, Taza replied, scanning the homestead. Your land is close to sacred hunting paths. For years, you did not disturb us. We watched. You left us alone. Elias gave a quiet nod. Still true. Taza looked toward Anna. The girl. She is the one who ran from Burke. Anna's voice was quiet but steady. Yes, you helped her, he said to Elias. I did. Taza's eyes lingered on the shattered window, the burned patch of wall where a bullet had scorched the siding, and the blood trail that still led into the brush from the man Elias had shot. We have tracked Burke for many seasons, he said. Finally, he has taken from our people, girls, children. He trades them west for whiskey and gold. Anna's face turned pale. He was going to sell me. Taza looked at her, and something flickered in his eyes. Not quite sorrow, not quite anger. A kind of quiet knowing. He has sold many. Elias stepped forward. He said more were coming. Taza nodded. His kind always return. But now we are here. They set up camp before sunset, just beyond the clearing. No tents, no fires, just quiet figures in the trees, blending into the land like they were born from it. Elias and Anna watched from the porch. She sat wrapped in one of his old blankets, a mug of coffee in her hands. He leaned on the rail, rifle across his lap. They didn't come for us, she said finally. No, Elias agreed. They came for him, but they stayed. He glanced at her. That bother you? She shook her head. No, it's the first time I've felt safe in a long while. Silence returned for a moment. Then she asked the question that had been building between them since the day they met. Why did you help me, Elias? He didn't answer right away. He stared into the trees, past the smoke trails in the distance, into a memory older than her. Scars, because 20 years ago, he said slowly, I didn't. Anna turned toward him. There was a girl, Elias continued. Not unlike you, maybe 17. She ran from a wagon camp. Men chased her. I had a rifle. I had time, but I didn't act. Told myself it wasn't my fight. He paused. The next day they found her body near the creek, bound to a tree. Anna said nothing, her hand resting gently over her own wristwear. The ropes had once burned. I built this place to forget it all, Elias said, but some ghosts knock louder than others. She looked at him, not with pity, but with understanding. You answered this time, she said. He nodded. I did. From the woods, an owl hooted, and behind them, they heard a sound that neither expected. Laughter, soft, from the Apache camp, one of the younger warriors telling a story. others responding in low chuckles. It wasn't much, but it was something. Anna sipped her coffee. They're not afraid. No, Elias said. They've faced worse. So, have we? He looked at her, and for the first time since she had entered his life, he smiled. Not out of politeness, but because something inside him, something buried long ago, had finally begun to thaw. When dawn finally broke over the ridge, the sky was bathed in lavender and soft orange, like the land itself had exhaled. The storm that had threatened days earlier had long passed, leaving behind a silence that no longer felt heavy. Smoke from a dozen small fires curled upward from the tree line where the Apache had made camp. Their silhouettes moved quietly through the mist, gathering their things with reverence, not haste. The night was over, and something, whether it was war, vengeance, or sorrow, had passed with it. Elias Cutter stood on his porch, arms crossed, watching the tree line. His rifle still leaned against the wall, but his hand wasn't on it. His eyes were tired, but clear. Beside him stood Anna, wrapped in one of his old canvas coats, barefoot in the soft dirt, her face turned to the rising sun. She hadn't asked to be here. She hadn't chosen this life, but she had survived it. And in doing so, she had changed the rhythm of a place that hadn't shifted in 20 years. Taza approached them without announcement, walking with the easy grace of someone who carried stories in his bones. He held a carved wooden staff and wore a necklace of leather and turquoise beads that swayed gently with each step. We will go west, Taza said. There are others to find, others to warn. Burke may be gone, but others like him remain. Elias nodded. He won't be coming back here. Taza gave a half smile. No, he will not. There was no need to describe what happened. They had found Burke's horse riderless in the creek. The rest had been left to the forest. Justice, in its own language, had been spoken. Anna stepped forward. Thank you for coming. Taza looked at her for a long moment. You carry more than bruises. But the land remembers people like you. Women who choose to fight when running would be easier. Anna bowed her head, unsure what to say. Taza turned to Elias. The land also remembers those who finally speak when silence has cost too much. Then he looked back at Anna and handed her something, an amulet of bone and stone tied on sinew string. For strength, he said, and for remembering. She clutched it close. I won't forget. He nodded and turned back to the trees. One by one, the warriors disappeared into the morning, like ghosts returning to where only the wind could follow. Elias and Anna stood watching them until they were gone. After a long silence, she asked, What happens now? He shrugged, still staring at the horizon. I fixed the fence, patched the roof, checked the north trail for coyotes. Same as always. She gave a small smile. And me. Elias looked at her. You stay if you want to. She turned toward him. You sure? He looked around at the landette, the soil he'd worked alone for 2 decades, the cabin that had echoed with silence, the porch that had never held more than one chair, then back at her. Never been more sure. She stepped off the porch into the sunlight. For the first time since he'd found her, she didn't flinch. She didn't wrap her arms around herself or scan the tree line for danger. She simply walked toward the corral, where the horses were waiting to be fed, as if she belonged there. Elias watched her go. And in the stillness that followed, he finally let out the breath he didn't know he'd been holding for 20 years. Later that morning, he brought out a second coffee mug. Not because she asked for it, but because it was hers now. And as the sun climbed over the prairie and warmed the dirt beneath their boots, the ranch went silent. Once haunted found its voice again, a voice that spoke not just of pain and memory, but of healing, and the promise of something new.